Voices of the Canyon. Chapter 1. The Road to the Canyon. The desert stretched wide under the burning sun, and the three travelers moved slowly across the dry land. Their horses carried them forward, step by step, while the wind lifted dust into the air. The land was silent, except for the sound of hooves and the creak of leather saddles. It was a hard road, but they had chosen it because it was the fastest way to the next settlement. The settlement promised water, food, and safety, but the path to reach it was not simple. The road led through an old canyon, a place that locals spoke of with caution. People said the canyon carried voices, and those voices told stories that were not easy to forget. Thomas Grayson rode at the front. He was 42 years old, with a strong build and a face marked by years of service as a soldier. His eyes were sharp, but they carried shadows of the past. He had fought in battles that left scars not only on his body but also on his mind. Now he traveled alone, searching for peace in the silence of the land. He believed that every place carried memory, and the desert was no different. As he looked at the horizon, he felt that the earth itself remembered pain and betrayal. He carried a small journal in his saddlebag, where he wrote his thoughts each night. It was his way of keeping order in a world that often felt broken. Elizabeth Carter rode behind him. She was 29, a widow who had lost her husband to illness 2 years earlier. Her life had been quiet before, but after his death, she felt empty and restless. She had left her home to search for something new, though she did not know what that was. Her face was pale, and her eyes often looked far away, as if she was listening to something no one else could hear. She stayed silent most of the time, but her silence was not weakness. It was the silence of someone who carried grief and was still learning how to live with it. She held her reins tightly, her hands trembling sometimes, but she did not turn back. She wanted to move forward, even if the road was uncertain. Jacob Miller walked beside the horses, guiding them through the desert. He was 35, a man who knew the land well. He had worked as a guide for many years, leading travelers through dangerous paths. His steps were steady, and his eyes watched the ground carefully. He knew where the rocks were loose, where the sand was deep, and where the snakes hid. He carried a rifle on his shoulder, but he trusted his knowledge more than his weapon. Jacob had heard the stories about the canyon. He knew people said it was cursed, that voices echoed through its walls. But he believed in the land, not in curses. Still, a small part of him wondered if the stories were true. The sun moved higher, and the heat pressed down on them. Sweat covered their faces, and their lips grew dry. They stopped at a small patch of shade, where a single tree grew against the rocks. Thomas looked at the canyon in the distance. Its walls rose high, dark against the sky. He felt a strange pull toward it, as if the canyon was waiting for them. Elizabeth looked at it too, her eyes full of worry. She felt that the canyon was not just stone and shadow. It was something alive, something that carried voices from the past. Jacob stood quietly, his face calm, but inside he remembered the warnings he had heard. He told himself that he was strong enough to guide them through, but he also knew that the canyon had a reputation for breaking people. They mounted their horses again and continued forward. The land grew rougher, and the air grew heavier. Each step brought them closer to the canyon, and each step carried more weight. Thomas thought about the battles he had fought, about the men he had lost, and about the choices he could not change. Elizabeth thought about her husband, about the life she had left behind, and about the emptiness that followed her. Jacob thought about the travelers he had guided before, about the dangers they had faced, and about the canyon that now stood ahead. The desert was wide, but the canyon was closer with every hour. Its walls seemed to rise higher as they approached, and its shadows stretched long across the ground. The air grew cooler, but the silence grew stronger. It was not the silence of empty land. It was the silence of a place that carried memory. Thomas felt it in his chest, Elizabeth felt it in her heart, and Jacob felt it in his steps. The road to the canyon was not just a path through stone. It was a path into the past, into secrets, into voices that waited to be heard. By the time the sun began to fall, the canyon stood before them. Its entrance was wide, dark, and silent. The three travelers stopped and looked at it. None of them spoke. They knew the road ahead was not simple. They knew the canyon carried stories. And they knew that once they entered, they would not leave unchanged. The desert had led them here, and now the canyon waited. The road to the canyon was complete, but the journey into its heart was only beginning. Chapter 2. The First Voices. When the three travelers stepped into the canyon, the air seemed to shift around them. The desert heat softened, and the shadows of the high stone walls stretched long across the ground. Every sound they made was carried back to them, repeated in strange patterns. The echo of their footsteps seemed louder than it should have been, as if the canyon itself wanted to remind them of each step. The horses grew restless, shaking their heads and snorting, as if they too felt the change. The silence of the desert was gone, replaced by something heavier, something alive. Thomas Grayson slowed his pace and looked up at the walls of the canyon. He had seen many landscapes during his years as a soldier, but this place felt different. The stones seemed to hold memory, and the air seemed to carry voices from the past. He felt a weight in his chest, the same weight he had carried since the war. He thought of the men he had lost, of the choices he had made, and of the guilt that never left him. When the first voice came, soft like the wind, he froze. It spoke of betrayal, of a brother who turned against his own. The words cut into him because they felt too close to his own story. He stood still, listening, unable to move forward. Elizabeth Carter rode behind him, her eyes closed against the brightness of the sun. She had lived with silence since the death of her husband, but the silence of the canyon was different. It was not empty. It was full of whispers. At first she thought it was only the wind, but then the words became clear. They spoke of a woman who waited for love that never returned, of promises broken, of prayers unanswered. Elizabeth felt her heart tighten. She had prayed for her husband's recovery, but her prayers had not been answered. She had waited for hope, but hope had not come. The voices seemed to know her pain, to speak directly to her grief. She closed her eyes tighter, as if hearing a prayer she had once spoken herself. Jacob Miller walked ahead, guiding the horses carefully over the uneven ground. He had heard stories about the canyon, but he had always told himself they were only tales. He believed in the land, in the wind, in the sound of stone. But when the voices came, he felt his confidence weaken. They spoke of a guide who had led people into danger, who had left them behind for gold. Jacob's hands tightened on the reins. He remembered choices he had made in the past, times when he had thought more of money than of people. He had told himself it was survival, but the voices made it sound like betrayal. He shook his head, trying to dismiss it as sound, as echo, as nothing more than air moving through stone. But doubt grew inside him, heavy and sharp. The canyon carried their steps deeper, and the voices grew stronger. They did not shout, but they did not fade. They spoke in calm tones, as if telling stories that had been waiting for years to be heard. Each traveler felt the words differently, but each felt them deeply. Thomas felt the weight of his past mistakes pressing harder. Elizabeth felt her grief rise again, raw and painful. Jacob felt his confidence break, replaced by fear that the canyon knew him better than he knew himself. The walls seemed to close in, not with stone, but with memory. They continued forward, but their movements were slower now. The canyon was no longer just a path. It was a place of judgment, a place where the past spoke through echoes. The voices were not loud, but they were clear. They told stories of betrayal, of love lost, of choices that could not be undone. The travelers did not speak to each other. They carried the voices inside, each one hearing something that belonged to them. The canyon had opened its mouth, and the past had begun to speak. By the time the sun began to fall behind the walls, the voices had become part of the air. They were not separate from the canyon. They were the canyon. Thomas stopped again, his hand resting on the stone, feeling its cold surface. Elizabeth kept her eyes closed, her lips moving silently as if in prayer. Jacob walked on, his face set, but his eyes full of doubt. The canyon had shown them its first voices, and none of them could ignore what they had heard. The road ahead was still long, but they already knew the journey would not be simple. The canyon had begun to test them, and the voices would not let them go. Chapter 3. Stories of the Past. The canyon grew darker as the travelers moved deeper between its walls. The sun still shone above, but the light seemed weaker, as if the stone itself swallowed it. The air carried a strange heaviness, and the echoes of their steps no longer sounded like simple noise. The voices had grown louder, clearer, and more insistent. They did not speak in anger, but in calm tones, as if telling stories that had been waiting for years to be heard. Each word seemed to belong to the canyon, carved into its walls, carried by its silence. Thomas Grayson felt the voices pressing against him more than the others. They spoke of war, of battles fought long ago, of a brother who betrayed his brother. The words struck him like blows, because he remembered his own service, his own mistakes. He had once trusted a fellow soldier, a man he called a brother, but that man had abandoned him in the middle of a fight. Thomas had survived, but others had not. The canyon seemed to know this story, though he had never spoken it aloud. He felt shame rise inside him, mixed with anger, mixed with sorrow. He wanted to forget, but the canyon would not let him. The voices reminded him that betrayal was not only in history, it was in his own life. Elizabeth Carter heard the voices differently. They spoke of a woman who waited and never saw her love again. The words were soft, almost like a prayer, but they carried pain. Elizabeth felt her own grief return, sharp and fresh. She had waited for her husband to recover from illness, prayed for his strength, hoped for his return to health. But he had died, leaving her alone. The canyon seemed to know her sorrow, to speak it back to her. She closed her eyes, but the voices did not fade. They told her that waiting could become endless, that love could be lost forever. She felt tears in her eyes, but she did not let them fall. She had promised herself to be strong, But the canyon reminded her that strength did not erase pain. Jacob Miller tried to ignore the voices, but they followed him with every step. They spoke of a guide who left people to die for gold. The words cut into him, because he remembered a time when he had chosen money over safety. Years ago, he had led a group of travelers through dangerous land. When trouble came, he had saved himself first, leaving others behind. He had told himself it was survival, but the canyon called it betrayal. He felt his chest tighten, his breath grow heavy. He wanted to believe it was only sound, only echo, only air moving through stone. But the voices were too clear. They spoke his secret, the one he had buried deep. He realized the canyon knew him better than he wanted to admit. The three travelers did not speak to each other. Each carried the voices inside, each felt the weight of their own past. The canyon had become more than stone and shadow. It had become a mirror, showing them what they wanted to forget. The walls seemed to breathe, the air seemed to listen, and the silence seemed to judge. They walked slowly, their steps heavy, their hearts full of memory. The canyon was not only a place of passage. It was a place of truth, a place where the past returned. By the time the sun began to sink lower, the voices had become part of the air. They did not fade, they did not stop. They spoke of betrayal, of love lost, of choices that could not be undone. Thomas felt his guilt rise again. Elizabeth felt her grief deepen. Jacob felt his doubt grow stronger. Each of them understood now that the voices were not random. They were personal. They were meant for them. The canyon carried their secrets, and it would not let them go. The road ahead was still long, but they already knew the journey would not be simple. The canyon had begun to test them, and the voices of the past had made their presence clear. None of them could escape what they had heard. None of them could escape themselves. The canyon had spoken, and its stories had become their own. Chapter 4. Night in the Canyon. The travelers stopped when the sun disappeared behind the high walls of the canyon. The air grew cooler, but the silence did not bring peace. The canyon seemed alive even in the night, and the voices did not fade. They whispered through the stone, carried by the wind, repeating stories that none of them wanted to hear. The fire they built gave light, but it did not chase away the shadows. The canyon held its own kind of darkness, one that reached into the mind more than into the eyes. Thomas Grayson sat apart from the others, his back against a rock, his journal open on his knees. He wrote slowly, his hand heavy, trying to put into words what he felt. He wanted to understand why the past had returned so strongly in this place. He wrote about the betrayal he had heard in the voices, about the memories of war that had followed him for years. He had carried guilt like a hidden wound, and now the canyon had opened it again. His writing was not neat, but it was honest. He hoped that by writing he could take control of his thoughts, but the voices seemed to read his words as he wrote them, echoing them back in broken fragments. He felt that the canyon was not only reminding him of the past but also judging him for it. Elizabeth Carter sat close to the fire, her hands folded tightly as she prayed. Her voice was soft, but her prayers mixed with the echo of the canyon. She asked for strength, for peace, for release from the grief that had followed her since her husband's death. But the canyon did not give her silence. Instead, it repeated her words, turning them into whispers that sounded like answers she did not want. She heard the voices speak of waiting, of love that never returned, of promises broken. She felt her heart ache, and she closed her eyes, but the voices were inside her now. She realized that prayer in this place was not only a call to heaven but also a call to the canyon itself, and the canyon answered with memories she had tried to bury. Jacob Miller sat near the fire, staring into the flames. He did not pray, and he did not write. He only listened. The voices spoke of guides who betrayed their travelers, of men who chose gold over loyalty. He felt the canyon accuse him directly. He remembered the choices he had made, the people he had left behind, the greed that had once ruled him. He had told himself that survival was enough, that he had done what he needed to live. But the canyon did not accept excuses. It spoke his past back to him, louder than his own thoughts. He felt his chest tighten, his breath grow heavy, and he wondered if the canyon wanted him to confess. He stared at the fire, but the flames did not comfort him. They only reminded him of the lives he had abandoned. The night was long, and none of them slept easily. The fire burned low, and the shadows grew taller. Each of them fought with their own memories, their own fears, their own secrets. The canyon did not let them rest. It held them in silence, but the silence was full of voices. Thomas wrote until his hand shook. Elizabeth prayed until her voice broke. Jacob sat until his body felt heavy. They were 3 people, but the canyon made them feel alone, each trapped inside their own past. When the first light of dawn touched the canyon walls, they were still awake. Their faces were pale, their eyes tired, but they had survived the night. The voices had not left, but they had learned something in the darkness. The canyon was not only a place of stone. It was a place of memory, a place that demanded truth. They understood now that the journey was not only through land but also through themselves. The canyon had shown them their shadows, and they could not turn away. The night had been long, but it had prepared them for what was still to come. Chapter 5. The Trial. The morning light touched the canyon walls, but it did not bring comfort. The 3 travelers rose from their restless night and continued forward. The path grew narrower, and the shadows stretched longer. The air felt heavy, as if the canyon itself was waiting for them. Each step echoed against the stone, and the voices returned, stronger than before. They no longer sounded like distant whispers. They spoke clearly, demanding answers, demanding truth. The canyon had become a place of judgment, and the travelers felt that they were standing before it like prisoners before a court. Thomas Grayson walked at the front, his face pale and his eyes dark with memory. He had carried guilt for years, hidden deep inside him, but the canyon would not let him hide anymore. The voices spoke of betrayal, of men abandoned, of choices that cost lives. He remembered the battlefield, the smoke, the cries of soldiers who trusted him. He had survived, but others had not, and he had never forgiven himself. The canyon seemed to know every detail, every moment he wanted to forget. He felt that he must admit his mistakes, not to the others, but to himself. His journal had carried his words before, but now the canyon demanded more. He realized that silence was no longer enough. He had to face the truth, even if it hurt. Elizabeth Carter followed behind, her hands tight on the reins. She had lived with grief since her husband's death, and she had carried it like a shadow. The voices spoke of waiting, of love that never returned, of promises broken. She felt her heart ache as if the canyon itself was speaking her pain aloud. She understood that she had been holding on to the past too tightly, keeping her sorrow alive instead of letting it rest. The canyon seemed to tell her that she must release it, that she must let go if she wanted to move forward. She realized that her journey was not only across the land but also through her own heart. She had to accept that love lost could not be returned, but peace could still be found. Jacob Miller walked slowly, his steps heavy. He had always believed he was strong, that he could guide others through danger, but the voices spoke of greed, of betrayal, of a guide who left people to die for gold. He remembered the choices he had made, the coin he had taken, the lives he had abandoned. He had told himself it was survival, but the canyon called it what it was, greed. He felt the weight of his past pressing down on him, heavier than the pack on his shoulders. He realized that he must confess, not to the others, but to himself. He had to admit that his greed had cost lives, that his choices had left scars. The canyon demanded honesty, and he could no longer deny it. The land seemed to wait for their decisions. The canyon was silent except for the voices, but the silence was not empty. It was full of expectation, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. Each traveler felt that the canyon would not let them pass until they faced their own truth. Each step was heavy, not because of the ground, but because of the weight inside them. They moved forward slowly, carrying their memories, their grief, their guilt. The canyon was not only a place of stone. It was a place of trial, a place where the past demanded answers. By the time the sun reached its highest point, the three travelers understood that the journey was not only about reaching the next settlement. It was about facing themselves. Thomas felt that he must admit his mistakes. Elizabeth understood that she must let go of the past. Jacob realized that he must confess his greed. The canyon had become their judge, and they had become their own witnesses. They kept moving, step by step, knowing that the trial was not yet over, but also knowing that they could not turn back. The canyon demanded truth, and they had begun to give it. Chapter 6. The Revelation. The travelers reached the center of the canyon as the sun stood high above them. The light fell across broken stones and scattered ruins, the remains of a place that had once been alive. The walls of the canyon rose tall around them, and the air grew heavy with sound. The voices that had followed them since the entrance became strong and clear. They no longer whispered like the wind. They spoke with certainty, telling them that the land remembered every act, every choice, every betrayal. The canyon was not only stone. It was memory, and it carried the truth of all who had walked through it. Thomas Grayson stood still, his eyes fixed on the ruins. He felt the voices pressing against him, reminding him of the men he had lost, of the mistakes he had carried for years. He had written in his journal many times before, but now his hand shook as he opened it again. He wrote a confession, not for others to read, but for himself. He admitted the choices he had made, the guilt he had hidden, the pain he had carried. His words were simple, but they were heavy. He felt that the canyon demanded honesty, and he gave it. As he finished, he placed the journal on the stone beside him, as if offering it to the land. For the first time, he felt a small release, a breath of freedom inside his chest. Elizabeth Carter stepped forward, her eyes full of tears. She had carried her husband's ring since his death, holding it as a reminder of love and loss. The voices spoke of waiting, of promises broken, of love that never returned. She understood that she had been holding on too tightly, keeping her grief alive instead of letting it rest. She took the ring from her hand and placed it on a stone in the ruins. The act was simple, but it felt like a release. She whispered a silent farewell, not to forget her husband, but to let go of the pain that had followed her. As she stepped back, she felt lighter, as if the canyon had accepted her offering and given her peace in return. Jacob Miller stood apart, his face tense. He had carried a gold coin for years, a coin he had once stolen during a journey that had cost lives. He had told himself it was survival, but the voices called it greed. He felt the canyon accuse him, demanding that he face the truth. Slowly, he took the coin from his pocket. It was small, but it carried the weight of his past. He placed it on the stone, his hand trembling. He admitted to himself that his greed had betrayed others, that his choices had left scars. As the coin touched the stone, he felt the voices grow softer. The canyon seemed to accept his confession, and for the first time, he felt that he could move forward without the burden of guilt. The ruins stood silent, but the air changed. The voices that had filled the canyon began to fade. They no longer spoke of betrayal or grief. They became soft, like breathing, like the sound of the land itself resting. The echo that had followed every step grew gentle, no longer heavy with judgment. The canyon had demanded truth, and the travelers had given it. In return, the canyon gave them silence, not empty, but peaceful. The three stood together, each changed by what they had done. Thomas felt his heart lighter, Elizabeth felt her grief ease, Jacob felt his guilt weaken. They understood that the canyon was not only a place of stone and shadow. It was a place of revelation, a place where the past could be faced and released. They had given their offerings, and the canyon had answered. The journey was not over, but they had taken the first step toward freedom. The land had remembered, and now it had let them go. Chapter 7. Leaving the Canyon. The three travelers moved slowly toward the edge of the canyon as the morning light spread across the stone walls. The air felt different now, lighter and softer, as if the land itself had changed. The voices that had followed them for days were gone. The silence was no longer heavy or full of judgment. It was calm, like a gentle breath. The canyon had released them, and each of them carried a new sense of peace inside. Thomas Grayson walked at the front, his steps steady and strong. For years he had carried the weight of war, the guilt of choices that had cost lives, and the memory of betrayal that had never left him. The canyon had forced him to face those memories, to admit them, and to write them down in his journal. Now, as he left the canyon, he felt his heart free for the first time in many years. The burden was not gone completely, but it no longer controlled him. He understood that mistakes could not be erased, but they could be accepted. He felt that the land had listened to him, and in return, it had given him peace. Elizabeth Carter followed behind, her face brighter than before. She had carried grief since the death of her husband, holding his ring as a symbol of love and loss. The canyon had shown her that holding on too tightly kept her trapped in sorrow. When she placed the ring on the stone, she had let go of the pain that had followed her. Now, as she walked out of the canyon, she smiled for the first time in a long while. It was a small smile, but it carried hope. She understood that love lost could not return, but life could still move forward. She felt lighter, as if the canyon had taken her grief and left her with strength. Jacob Miller walked silently, his eyes fixed on the path ahead. He had carried guilt for years, hiding the memory of greed that had once ruled his choices. The canyon had spoken his secret aloud, forcing him to admit it. When he placed the stolen coin on the stone, He had confessed to himself what he had tried to deny. Now, as he left the canyon, his eyes showed peace. He did not speak, but his silence was no longer heavy. It was calm, like the silence of a man who had faced his past and accepted it. He understood that survival was not enough if it came at the cost of others. He felt that the canyon had judged him, but also forgiven him. The three travelers reached the open desert, and the air felt wide and free. The sun warmed their faces, and the wind carried no voices, only the sound of the land itself. They looked back once at the canyon, its walls tall and silent, holding the memories of all who had passed through. They knew that the canyon would always remember, but they also knew that it had released them because they had accepted the truth. Each of them carried a lesson, and each of them carried a new strength. The journey ahead was still long, but they no longer feared it. They had faced the trial of the canyon, and they had found redemption. The land had shown them that truth may be heavy, but only truth brings freedom. They walked forward together, changed by what they had seen, and ready to face whatever waited beyond the horizon. Moral: every land remembers the past. The voices of the canyon showed that redemption is possible when a person admits mistakes. Truth may be heavy, but only truth brings freedom. Thank you for your attention. If you like the story, please like and subscribe. It motivates us to make new videos and helps us promote the channel. Thank you.